So hello and welcome to all of you to this session on safeguarding global scientific collaboration. My name is Magdalena. I'm editor-in-chief of Nature, an international multidisciplinary journal of science. So of course collaboration is very close to my heart. And science is collaborative in nature, and increasingly so. I believe we all know this instinctively, despite the all too frequent image in the public eye of this lone genius scientist. But long gone is the era of an individual working away in isolation from everyone else, including colleagues and also the society. This is in part because science is tackling increasingly more complex problems, and of course, many of them are global in nature. There are countless examples that illustrate the collaboration, how essential is collaboration for scientific progress. Of course, COVID vaccine development, particle physics, such as done at CERN, space exploration, genomic medicine, and many, many others. And yet, we are entering an era of increased national focus, which may encourage competition and isolationism rather than collaboration. And so to discuss how global scientific collaboration can be safeguarded, as it should be, I have with me here this absolutely fantastic panel representing a range of key and relevant perspectives. Just as a reminder, if you're tweeting, please do so. I encourage you to do so, and of course use the hashtag WEF22 when you do so. So without further ado, let me introduce my panelists, starting from the left here. I have Sarah Al-Almiri, who is Minister of State for Public Education and Advanced Technology in United Arab Emirates, and she also chairs the UAE Space Agency. Next to her is Fabiola Gianotti, who's a physicist and Director General of CERN. She's been with CERN since the mid-90s and is a member of many academies and recipients of countless awards. She also co-leads World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Scientific Collaboration, of which I'm also a member. To her left is Maria Leptin, who is President of European Research Council. Prior to that, she was Director of European Molecular Biology Organization herself. She has a distinguished career as a researcher in biology. And last but definitely not least, we have Dan Vadat, who is the founder and CEO of Huma, a global digital health company advancing digital-first care delivery and research to help people live longer and fuller lives. So let me start with a general question. I think we're all in agreement that scientific collaboration is essential to science, but also to global progress. But why do you feel, from your perspective, it is so essential that we safeguard scientific collaboration? And I'm going to start with you, Maria, actually.
Thank you. I think, Magdalena, instead of answering that question, I want to make one point that I think will underlie everything we discuss here. And that is the issue of trust in, not trust in science by non-scientists, but trust in scientific collaborations. So first of all, science is international, as you've said. Scientists actually don't care very much about borders. They care about following their spark and getting the information they need from wherever they need it. We move internationally, so we have connections everywhere. I think that's a given. So another point I want to make is that the level at which we're talking here, international collaboration, probably at a national level, also operates at a much smaller level, the individual researcher or the individual research group. So it's guided by the exact same things. And science is competitive in nature. You've got to be first, otherwise what you find is not a new discovery. So in nature, science is competitive. We have to keep that in mind. But also, science benefits from sharing. Sharing information is good for everyone. It has problems. And in fact, my own lab members, whenever they went to conferences, would say, Maria, can I talk about this new finding, et cetera, et cetera. I say, talk about it. You'll get more than you give. Give and you'll get back, and the more you give, the more you get back. So on average, you do better if you share openly. Of course, you occasionally get scooped, and then you think I shouldn't have shared. But that's the essence of it. And that's where trust comes in. This sharing works on trust. And members of the community who don't observe that trust and who do scoop you will gradually become cut off from the information. There are the black sheep in the community, and you don't talk to them, so you talk to your other colleagues. And so to get back to the national level, I think this has to be kept in mind, and there are obvious issues on which we have to work together globally. I mean, the pandemic is one, and climate is one. You can't do this nationally. This requires. But there are also others where we want to work together. Space station is one such case. You know, we don't need the space station, but it is something we do together voluntarily. Working on poverty will need collaboration. Very large telescopes. Your institution, Paola, that's an international, where we voluntarily work together. But again, I think internationally, the need for working together, the benefit for working together will be undermined if any of the national players misuse the trust, send in their graduate students to other countries to learn and bring back home and not give. And I think these nations will find progressively themselves also to be cut off. So I think this has to be remembered, and it's the tragedy of the commons. If that's gone, it's gone, and will be very hard to restore. So that's a very negative note. I hope we will progress on a more positive note, but I think it's something that needs to be remembered.
Well, I would say you made quite a number of positive comments in your intervention here, and I'm really struck by what you teased out about the balance between competition and collaboration, and I hope we can come back to this in the discussion. Fabiola, you lead an organization which, of course, has a very long history of collaboration. What's your perspective on this?
Thank you, Magdalena, and thanks for having me in this very distinguished panel. So, I grew up at CERN, and as you mentioned, CERN is a place where, well, scientific collaboration and collaboration across borders in general is really part of our DNA. I would like to remind everyone that CERN was born in 1954 in the aftermath of World War II with two main goals. One was to bring back scientific excellence in research in Europe after the war, and the second one was to promote peaceful collaboration between European countries after the disasters of the war. So already at that time it was recognized that science is a glue, is a bridge. So coming to your question about safeguarding scientific collaboration, why should we continuing to do so? I will say for three main reasons. First of all, because scientific collaboration and open science, which goes hand in hand with scientific collaboration, boosts science. Science is based on the exchange of information, maximizes the global impact of research, and is also a powerful tool to reduce the inequities across the world. So open science, open education, science, knowledge and technology available to everyone is essential to reduce the gap between the rich and lower income countries, those with and those without access to all these important assets of our life. The second reason is that, as you mentioned, Magdalena, today's challenges are global, they are complex, and they are interconnected. And so they require really collaboration not only across borders, because these challenges are planetary challenges, from the pandemic to climate change. So across borders, across disciplines, and across sector. So private-public collaboration. And last but not least, science being universal, because the law of natures are the same everywhere on Earth, and unifying, science can connect people in our fractured world. Science can keeps bridges when all other bridges are burned, and therefore also facilitate the process of rebuilding when times come. And of course, we live in an epoch with a war in Europe, so maybe this is also a message in the current context.
Thank you for that. A number of really, really important points, especially the last one at a current time. And of course, the current conflict in Europe is present on everyone's mind. But of course, there are other conflicts that happen in the world also. And that idea of, first of all, science being the glue and a bridge, but also providing that foundational network for rebuilding, moving on, I think is really important. And connecting people. I think sometimes perhaps we forget that there is this very human aspect to science. I think that's very important to remember. So both of you spoke about a couple of other points which I hope to return to, which are very important in the context of collaboration, that openness, the sharing, which of course goes hand in hand with trust, and that's really important. And I think, Maria, you said scientists don't care about borders. And yet, of course, at least some of the funding in science comes from governments. It can have a national perspective. So then there can be seen as if there is a tension between national interest, national competitiveness, and international global challenges that scientists want to face. So, Sarah, from your perspective, from within a government, as a minister, how do you see that tension? And why do you feel global scientific collaboration needs to be safeguarded?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Initially, I don't think there is a tension. And the reason of not having a tension is that most national agendas have global contexts and global challenges to solve for. The problems of the world, as was mentioned, are the problems of the world. The mechanisms by which national agendas come into play when it comes to research and research funding just has a local prioritized vertical within that general agenda. That's the first premise that any public policy individual or groups of individuals need to take into consideration when setting their national agendas, is one, declaring that global problems are global problems. Healthcare is a global problem. Climate change is a global problem. For example, coastlines transformations that we're seeing, these are all global problems. The context by which we bring on is specializing in a local context. The second aspect is building collaboration into research agenda. So one of our key pillars or one of our key objectives of research and development is to utilize international collaboration as a mechanism to increase the impact and outcomes of science. So that's a general premise of how we approach funding that goes into legislation and goes into public policy. So it sort of trains and creates an internal fabric of what is the right mechanism to work in a global context with local focus. The third is ensuring that your scientific funding is consistent, regardless of changes in priorities for a government. Science is long-term, and solving issues needs to be long-term. They're not aspects that you can pick and choose and change year on year or every 5 years. And last, it's showing impact on the ground. Funding a mix of both fundamental research and collaboration on that front, and also impact and outcomes when it comes to finding real actionable on the ground changes. That builds the trust not only locally from a local context or trust for the science from non-science communities to the science community, but it also ensures a comprehensive lens for collaboration that follows through at every end of the spectrum of research to development and implementation.
Wonderful. I love the idea of building collaborations into the research agenda. Again, something else I'm hoping to come back to. Thank you for that. And again, I think we will all be it would be good for us to consider how we can view that the parallel between the global and the local problems agenda. As you say, it's perhaps a matter of scale as opposed to an opposition. So, Dan, let me turn to you. From your perspective, perhaps you can comment on how you see the importance of that global collaboration, maybe across sectors. That's something that you have specific experience in as well.
Sure, no. I think it is really important to recognize the scientific collaboration is important, but that science becomes applicable. You have to take it and bring it to the real world. And this is where other aspects of the different industries and different collaborators, they become really important to also to consider and make them part of the journey. Now, let me take you through a journey. Let's go back to January 2020. And I'm going to take you through the kind of the life we went as HUMA. And as you guys know, we are really focused on bringing digital first care to look after patients remotely when and if possible. So we have collaborations with big companies like Apple and Tencent and Amazon, but also healthcare systems and so on. January 2020, first week, we had a group of people agreed beforehand from Tencent visiting our office in London. And that was the beginning of COVID. Nobody really knew what's going on. There was stuff happening in China. We got first insight through that. Okay, there is a conditions, quite serious, and these are the things that you can track and monitor, and you might be able to look after these patients remotely. And then almost a month and a half after that, started, growing in Europe massively, and March obviously was the peak of it. We had governments contacting us, one of which German governments, UK governments. Can we launch a solution to be able to look after these patients? A disease that nobody knows what's going on with the patients, how complex it is. A condition that you have a patient and you can't really bring them to the hospital. This is the normal way you usually look after the patients. And a population that is really scared, whether you get the disease or whether you're not and you're trying to avoid it. And the collaborations we saw in that few weeks during that time is phenomenal. And I will take you through that step by step. Obviously, conversations with governments, health ministries, we started working on it. We had some insight from China, what's going on with the disease. We partnered with Heidelberg in Germany and Imperial in UK and Johns Hopkins in the US. Started to coming up with the right clinical, scientific protocol, medical protocol to monitor these patients, which became, at today's word, actually the standard, and everyone almost follows that through the work we did because of the insight we got from scientists in China initially. And then we wanted to deploy the solutions. The idea for the first country was, this is a country of 80 million people. How can we launch a platform to support everyone if needed to be? Germany, one of the first country, and UK. This is a big operations. To be able to do that, we had to launch an app. So we had to get approval from regulator. It happened overnight through their support. We had to build the software. Obviously, we put a lot of effort ourselves. We had to ship devices. One of those devices was oxygen saturation measurement device, SpO2. We ordered 1 million of those to start with. We had to call Lufthansa executives to get them shipped from China because that was where the manufacturing was. The border had to accelerate, otherwise you have to wait a couple of weeks. And the health minister gave us 3 weeks from the start of the project to be live across a nation ultimately. And then we had to ship these devices to every hospitals, every clinics. So this is where we partnered with Amazon. I actually wrote to Jeff, and through Jeff Bezos' support, we got them in place, and all of these things happened in 3 weeks. Then we were launching our application, and as you know, each time you submit an app, on especially the Apple Store, they take their time, like 3 days, 2 weeks, to approve it. I wrote to Tim Cook. Tim Cook accelerated that. And in 3 weeks, we did nationwide platform rollout, which was ready to look after any patient across one country. And then 2 weeks later, we did the same for part of UK, with a lot of scientific insight, a lot of medical insight from UK, China, German scientists, and America, Johns Hopkins. And if we didn't have the collaborations that got accelerated through every stakeholders, we wouldn't be able to do. And that has never happened actually in the history of any country or any nation, as a matter of fact. So now With collaboration, magic happens. And I think the message for me to really reiterate here is, how can we help between us, this group, all the people that are listening, all the people that are sitting here, to actually not only talk about collaborations, start doing it. And it can start here in this room. Good example leads, and after that, you know what, we have a couple of other national projects that we are doing, because they saw what happened in Germany and in UK, and then other countries are following one by one. An initiative that considered impossible to do, point blank. And that is what I really want to share here, and welcome everybody.
Thank you for these examples. We seem to have some interference from outside. Others are arriving, obviously, at the meeting. Thank you for these examples. And what strikes me in this story that you shared with us, fascinating example of success, is of course that this is an example of success beyond scientific community itself. So this makes me think back to the point that you made about the collaboration within the research community, but also beyond it, to enable those collaborations, to enable them to, as you were saying, for science to have greater impact and more successful outcomes. Do you feel that researchers are ready and open for collaboration that includes other stakeholders so that their own collaborations are accelerated?
No. Research is not even ready for researchers. Researchers compete. Sometimes they don't share information because they want to publish first. One group wants to keep the data or have a technology that the other group doesn't. Even in that level, it's very competitive, and it's wrong. Because imagine a world that we collaborate, all of us. And I guarantee you in that world, we can cure cancer, as an example, hypothetical, 2 years earlier, versus another world that people don't collaborate. All of us, for sure in the span of 2 years, gonna lose a friend or a family member due to cancer. Wouldn't it be cool to not have that, if we could have? But it's not there yet, in our view.
So I'm going to bring Maria and Fabiola here, because each of you made a comment which is pertinent to what Dan just said. So Maria, you talked about that balance between competition and collaboration. How do we strike the right balance so we can be competitive and collaborate, or compete collaboratively, or collaborate competitively, whichever way you want to turn it around?
Well, at the level of the individual researcher, that's obviously a big personality issue. You know, I'm a mega risk taker, so I always talk to people, and I've got scooped many times in my career. That doesn't matter so much, you know. In the end, it's all good for science, and I didn't do that badly. But I disagree with you that researchers don't collaborate across all sorts of dimensions. I mean, everybody looks for the best way of solving their problems. And in fact, the most fun way of solving problems is to talk to other people. I mean, I've experienced this over the last 10 years where I was in an environment where there were physicists and mathematicians and theoreticians, etc. Or you go to conferences and suddenly see a completely different approach to your problem. I think researchers are, how shall I say, it's not cynical, it's not selfish, it's just the way it is. You soak in everything you can, and if you put it at researchers' feet, they'll take it. The competition, the balance of competition and collaboration, it's a difficult one both between countries and between individual researchers. Of course, every country has an interest to spend their tax dollars in the interest of their citizens. And it's very hard always to explain non-selfish, altruistic ways of spending the money. In fact, we at the ERC face the same thing. People say, how can you fund ivory tower research when there are these global challenges? Put the money there. My answer is, we have put the money there. We put it there 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, so that the solutions you need for new challenges have been worked out already by researchers who didn't know they were working for the solutions for those challenges. So I think I mean, my initial statement may have been negative. I'm actually very optimistic. If you let them, researchers, and give them some protection. Of course, if you're only judged on whether you published that paper in, say, Nature, a day before your competitor published it elsewhere, that's bad. So we also have need a more holistic way of access of judging output, and collaboration and sharing, as Fabiola has said, are very important components. So we need rewards for that. We need to move away from the rewarding only reinforcing the natural competitive. That's not good.
100%. But my point is not there isn't. Actually, maybe scientists, they do the most collaborations of all. But science is selfless. And the idea is, how can we do more? And for sure, I don't know about every industry. I come from a medicine and medical industry. There is a huge competitiveness between scientists, between different healthcare providers, which are source of science, hospitals, and so on. And even sometimes they don't share care pathway that can lead to saving lives. That's why you go to, and I don't want to name institutions, Institution X at the US, because they do cancer management of breast cancer patients better, because they use a very unique care pathway that, I don't know, some university hospitals in the UK doesn't, or vice versa. I think we can do more, and doing more can start today. And COVID was a good example. We did more.
Right. I mean, of course, crisis definitely focuses the mind. That's very clear. And we have plenty of examples. And I think all of us wish that we retained many of the lessons that we've learned during the pandemic, that we retain them as we go forward. I just want to emphasize something you just said, Maria, which actually echoes what you said, Sarah, about the timelines of funding and supporting science. It's so important. We have examples actually, from the pandemic, the vaccines themselves, the fundamental research underpinning that, of course, unfolded over many years and was funded from public funds and also as part of basic research. And perhaps there is a little bit of a tension between the tenure of any one government who makes decisions on funding and the time over which scientific discoveries unfold. I'm sure all of you here on the panel and many of you in the room here will be familiar with that tension. So, Fabiola, you talked about the importance of open science and sharing, and that's of course also came out from what Dan and Maria said. We can't imagine collaboration without sharing and open science. Again, is there tension? Are we as scientists, or we as members of the research community, sufficiently supported in doing that?
I will say that, that there is still a lot to do, because there are, of course, threats to scientific collaboration and to open sharing of information. Maria mentioned one of them, trust. There is a decline of trust globally. She mentioned it in another maybe context at the level of individuals, but there is also a global decline of trust, deficit of trust, and so governments, countries sometimes do not collaborate as they should be doing. And it's also interesting to note that science can help build trust, but science without trust and openness is not successful. So we have to be also very, very careful in that. Then there is the problem of competition, of course, that was mentioned before, and the problem of security also, for instance, for dual use of technology or dual use science, which of course bring governments or policymakers sometime to have protective approaches, and this of course undermine the foundation of science, which is the exchange of information, but also the way science works. For instance, the peer review. When you are a scientist, what you do must be peer reviewed by people that are expert in your field and across the world, not just in your little local environment. So I see more and more emphasis on open science in all its facets, but also many threats that come from the big crisis we have today. So we have to resist in some sense, and to make sure that crisis and also sometimes emotional reactions to crisis do not bring us back, many years back in what we have achieved.
So, just to add on to that point, you mentioned open science, you mentioned protectionism when it comes to dual use. Legislations need to be designed for each one of those instances based on what area it's applicable for.
Absolutely.
What we see today is a blanket approach. So you'd have a single policy on science and technology that has to deal with dual use. You'll have a single policy applied all the time, but not have an exemption during times of crises.
Absolutely.
And an approach on legislation needs to take those into consideration. There's various routes it needs to go down, and then there's various mechanisms that you need to put it into place, and there's a kill switch when need be. And that's an interesting, at least for myself as in public policy, an interesting finding on the back of the pandemic, where yes, science needs to be approached and dealt with differently based on the situation, and you can't take a blanket approach.
If I may agree fully with what you said, it's a question of open science, it's also a question of policies, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution to the problem, so it has to be adapted. But we need to put the policies in place, and I don't see that kind of impetus and focus on that yet.
So what prevents that? Why are we not as successful? We identify the need. Why are we not successful with driving our policies? I mean, do you want to comment from a government perspective or scientific perspective?
One, government portfolios are broad. You discuss science technology policies. Science and technology policies are broad, and therefore the results of the policy making and the legislations will be by default broad. Mm-hmm. You need to take a step back and admit that it is specialized, and therefore the approach has to be specialized. So it has to be a balance between two. Where do you put public policy that's broad to govern a broad area of science and technology? And in which areas that are of high priority or areas that would benefit, for example, in portions of healthcare, open data is beneficial. Do you create a specific topic level or subsector level policy? And it's those discussions that are typically not on the table in public policy, because you need to do it for the entire sector and not focus at a particular sector. So that, from my perspective, is one mechanism to tackle that. The second, and we were talking about this area earlier, there's no global fora that comes in and says, in this sector, this is what the general policies that we'll be working on globally to enable collaboration to happen. Those are the generals. When we talk about open data, this is how each nation will take onto itself to protect the rights and the outcomes and procedures. And that then speaks to the issue of trust.
Yes.
Countries and nations and even individuals and researchers typically work with ecosystems that they understand fully what exists from a legislative perspective, from a public policy perspective, from a priority perspective, from a long-term vision perspective. And that's natural. That's how you minimize the risk that you're taking on into any collaboration. And that requires better interoperability for that trust to be built, so that we're all speaking, at least in the foundations, the same language.
So is it then fair to say that if we want to safeguard scientific collaborations, we actually have to look to being collaborative beyond the boundary of science? So yes. What I'm hearing from you, that perhaps for governments and policymakers to understand the granularity of the policies that they make, they actually need advice of experts. So would you then actually recommend that researchers themselves get more involved so they
yes.
can help themselves, if you like?
Absolutely, and the way that we've done it is we've created at least 3 to 4 different advisory groups on different areas of science. And so we're going through the process of setting our national research and development agenda and prioritization. And scientists actually have a say when it came to the division of the priority areas. How are you going to cut it? The objectives of research and development, the enablers that need to go into place, the mechanism by which we down select prioritization. So they've got a voice on the table to at least speak on what it is, so that the lens doesn't become a single top-down lens, and it doesn't become a lens driven by industry, and it doesn't become a lens driven by economic needs. And it's ensuring that the voice of every single party is equal. And then you mentioned something, because we are facing challenges there. Researchers in the science community need to take a pause to actually give input to those fields.
if I may, on this point that the Minister raised, I would like to mention a very nice initiative of the WEF Young Scientists. They proposed and they said, well, what if 1 million of scientists, this is about 10% of the total number of scientists across the world, could develop a couple of hours per week, so this makes in total 100 million hours a year, of their time to engage with policymakers and to global leaders, to have the science heard, to develop the right policy, to have science as one of the main interlocutors with governments and policymakers, and also to improve our preparedness for crises like the pandemic. So I think this is a very nice proposal. I'm not so sure if it will be implemented, but it's something that I wanted to mention.
Thank you. It's a great example. Maria, you want to make a comment?
Well, yes, that's a nice idealist view. I'm an optimist, but I think I'm also a realist. And researchers are researchers, and of course it'd be great if they interacted with policy. But let's keep in mind, and your view from the government perspective is very interesting. Let's keep in mind that in Europe, where we're trying to do things together, and you know, I'm the president of the European Research Council, so we have standards for that. But in Europe, we do not even have unified ethics standards. We do not have a common guidelines for research integrity. So it's not as easy as that, and it should be there. I myself have worked on that, but it requires a lot of idealism to continue to work on that. And I think we also have to, we would like to think that science is apolitical, and that I think even appears somewhere in the outline of this talk, of this session. But of course science is not apolitical. There's a lot of politics involved, and we've seen it just recently. It's being used. And so to disentangle all that, I think we have a long way to go. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and doesn't mean that everything that's been said isn't necessary to pursue. But yes, let's get a common framework within which to work, and everybody contribute. But
exactly.
So I'm sitting here next year and the year after and the year after saying the same thing.
That's right, and we certainly agree on the fact that we have to view this problem in a context. So we can't talk about scientific collaborations in isolation from everything else, and we won't be able to secure them if we don't work towards common standards. And Maria, thank you for pointing out that even within Europe, we still have some way to go.
Yes, some countries don't have any guidelines at all. Some institutions don't have guidelines. Complete patchwork, and nothing at European level.
That's
with
right.
a few exceptions, to be clear. Of course, there are guidelines on embryo research and on stem cells, and a few other things, and some sort of health research guidelines. But it's minimal. It doesn't cover the breadth of what we've just heard about.
Exactly. I wonder, are there any questions or comments from the floor? We covered quite. Oh, there are some. There's a question here at the front.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. So my name is Fatima Zahara, and I'm a global shaper from Morocco. So when we speak of safeguarding global scientific collaboration, I think one key element of that collaboration should be complementarity, right? So I'm just curious, question to the panel, how do you ensure that complementarity in the work and the organizations that you're part of?
Who would like to comment? Or actually, can I ask you, sorry, I'm going to ask you to bring the microphone back. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by complementarity in this context?
Sure. So when we look at the amount of research papers that are being published every year, there are millions of that worldwide, right? And they're all studying similar and different topics. So ideally, to be able to kind of ensure that complementarity, we would need some way to synthesize that information that is already published, make it available kind of in some, like I'm not really sure how that would work, because right now I'm assuming it's non-existent, right? But in terms of not repeating the wheel, not reinventing the wheel, knowing what has happened, what are the gaps that we need to fill, how can we collaborate together in a way that we try to flip the coin of that competitiveness that you've spoken about, that exists in science, that is healthy to scientific evolution, but at the same time, how can we make that competitiveness work to our advantage by adding that complementarity kind of other side of the coin to it? I hope that was...
Yeah, thank you. So Dan, I think you wanted to, maybe I can speak to it as well, but Dan,
You go
please go
first.
ahead.
You go first.
Well, so from a perspective of a scientific journal, of course, much of what we do in terms of curation and synthesis speaks directly to what you were asking about. And of course, the question always is, are we doing enough of it, and to what extent we can do it better? I think it's absolutely crucial that we bring together through reviews, through special issues, through commentaries, through actually identifying gaps in the knowledge or gaps in the perspective from which questions are asked and answered. I think that's absolutely essential. And scientific journals and scientific publishers have an important role to play there. It's an aid in identifying new directions, or indeed, as you say, filling the gaps in already existing knowledge.
I don't have the answer for you, but one of the points that Maria mentioned is really valid, how we reward. Because right now, the biggest reward is how many publications I have done. Obviously, Nature and others, they have created these impact factors, and then how many
No,
people...
Nature didn't.
No, we didn't.
No, I mean people like you guys in the industry. And through that, how many people reference to your research that you have published. But are there other ways to encourage people don't go for quantity and go for quality? And if people focus on quality, number one, so many things that are being published won't need to be published because are repetitive, not good quality research. But also people are trying to look, okay, X, Y, Z, they have built these things. How can I add on top of it in a complementary way, something, an angle that it wasn't discovered before? And that mechanism of reward that was mentioned before is really, really important. And I think there are some rooms for improvements.
That's definitely an important point. We have time for a very quick comment or question.
So I just wanted to ask a general question in here. I mean, you all come from a very legacy institutions or legacy systems for scientific research. What would be your top priority if you are empowered beyond resources that are available for us at the moment to tackle an impactful change of scientific field? Because we're all here to know how can we change the status quo and how can we recreate the status quo if we have an absolute amount of research that is available for us. We cannot negate the fact that scientific research is actually an economic power, because countries who have scientific research today are the ones who are dictating the world global economy. So how can we use that for the greater good? And I'm asking everybody here on the floor to give one top priority that they would love to see going forward to shake the current status quo and to just move beyond the barriers.
Thank you very much. Your question pretty much closes the panel. It was kind of along the lines of what I was going to ask, so it's perfectly timed. Thank you. And let me just put that question in the context of our focus and extend it, which you didn't articulate it specifically, but I think that's what you meant as well, is how can we achieve that through collaboration, but make that collaboration equitable? Maria?
I'll answer your question, not yours.
Oh.
And you said specifically beyond my power. What I would do is make every child begin to learn in kindergarten the value of the scientific method. The reason we have mistrust from society in science is because society does not understand the scientific method. It does not understand what our truth, which they doubt, is based on. That's the first thing. And the next thing, I would make all governments, which would deal with the problem you said, understand the value of free fundamental research. If we had those two things, we wouldn't be having this discussion.
So literally 20 seconds. Sarah, what would be your...
Reshaping public policy, not from a local perspective, but from a global perspective, especially when it comes to addressing key challenges in science and opening up new venues for collaboration. So that's my...
Thank you. Fabiola?
I agree fully with Maria. Actually, she stole some of my points. But anyway, the others for me will be, you mentioned it, open science. Of course, it goes beyond what I can do, but open science, education, science and technology available to everybody free of charge. And this is also very difficult, if governments could really preserve some space for individual researchers to continue to collaborate despite the fact that their governments are not the best friends of each other.
Perfect. Dan?
I have to actually summarize what was shared before. The openness and making as much as possible open source, free access, even some of the publications people can access, and you have to pay a lot of money, number one. And number two, exact things that was shared. If people understand it, we could do what we could do in Germany because of Angela Merkel. She got the science better than lots of people in the political level. And if that knowledge is in everybody, you don't need to be expert, you don't need to be the best scientist in the world, but get the basic of it. We are not needed here. Nobody needs to think about these kind of topics. It takes care of itself.
Thank you. So I would add to you, I think that equity aspect is really important. And I think it's through sharing in that collaborative setting of knowledge, expertise, building capacity and infrastructure, so that scientific collaboration can be extended actually globally, not confined to one part of the world. So with this, we're going to close. We certainly did not solve the problem here. I think this is ongoing, but if there's one message that we can take away is that we can't talk about just collaborations within the scientific community. We have to talk about it in a wider context so that it's enabled by governments, by society, but the researchers themselves have work to do in that context. So collaboration in the end has to be beyond the boundary of research itself. Thank you very much to my fantastic panel and to all of you. Thank you. Thank you.